Mere weeks ago, the US Navy put its newest air-to-air missile in service. It's the biggest and longest-ranged US air-to-air missile ever, and it's based on the SM-6, the US Navy's premier SAM missile. For a few years now, the new missile has occasionally been spotted under Super Hornet fighter jets, pointing to an air-launched variant being in development. Finally, in early July, a flurry of images came, removing doubt. The missile seen on Super Hornets indeed has an air-to-air role. Its designation, AIM-174. AIM means the missile is an air-to-air one. This video will cover the potential of the new missile. It will compare it with the now retired Phoenix missile AMRAAM and China's big air-to-air missile. But even more importantly, the video will explore how the missile might be used and why it is such a big deal for the US near-future firepower. As visible from the images, the missile is really just a regular SM-6 without the booster. A special harness to serve as an interface between the missile and the aircraft pylon seems to have been added though. We're still talking about a huge weapon, possibly the biggest air-to-air missile in history. It weighs 1900 pounds. It's over 5 times heavier than AMRAAM. It's almost double the weight of the F-14's Phoenix air-to-air missile. Actually, it's close in weight to big air-to-ground weapons. Now the booster weighs another 1500 pounds. Some might ask, why not keep the booster? It would make the missile even longer ranged. There are of course issues with said approach. Such a package would weigh as much as a Tomahawk cruise missile with its own booster. It would weigh down the whole plane. But crucially, it would require missile redesign. The joint between the booster and the missile simply isn't designed to withstand horizontal carriage, let alone some additional stresses during maneuvers. The role of the booster on SM-6 is to get the missile to some speed and altitude before the main body rocket motor takes over. Essentially, that's exactly what the fighter jet is there for. It acts as the booster for the missile as it gets it to a high altitude and a high subsonic speed. It's also possible launches might be done at near Mach 1.5, though that's conjecture. That might require fuel tanks to be dropped. Maybe a single tank could be retained with a pair of 174s at Mach 1.2 or so. Truth of the matter is, missile's Mk-72 booster, however large, pales in comparison to a fighter jet as a booster. Observing SM-6 missile launch videos, one can see that the booster motor dies out after 6 or so seconds. Using known weight and alleged thrust values, as well as known SM-3 flight envelope graph, as SM-3 is of similar weight and uses the same booster, one can deduce that the main body of the SM-6, after it drops the booster, is around 7,000 feet in altitude, and that it might be doing around Mach 2 speed-wise at said moment. So sure, the missile is roughly 2 times faster when using a booster, but it's also over 4 times lower at the moment the booster detaches. And altitude is much more important than speed when it comes to missile glide range. If you're curious as why that is, stick to the end of the video for the more technical stuff. Anyway, why is AIM-174 important to the US? Primarily, it outranges every other air-to-air missile the US has or had. It's possibly the longest-reaching air-to-air missile anyone ever made. Back in 1973, the AIM-54 Phoenix performed the then longest recorded test shot. It was fired against a supersonic Firebee drone from 125 miles away. Keep in mind the actual distance traveled for the missile before impact was little over 80 miles. The US retired the Phoenix missile and relied on AMRAAMs, which started off as a medium-range missile but by the D model got some serious range. So much so that a few years ago the D model bettered that 1973 Phoenix range result, likely by a tiny margin. AMRAAM-D, thanks to its two-way data link and GPS, can rely on even more optimized trajectories to reach incoming targets that were 125 miles away at the moment of launch. So how does AIM-174 compare to that? The RIM-174 missile, meaning SM-6, was tested and launched with its booster, doing a ballistic trajectory to cover 250 statute miles and hit a static sea level target. That's some 400 kilometers away. That figure is of course not directly comparable. A. It is distance to target at the moment of impact. meaning missile travel distance, comparable to 80 miles traveled for Phoenix and AMRAAM tests. Furthermore, the test target for the Phoenix was going at Mach 1.5 at 50,000 feet up. The SM-6 test target was static at sea level. That altitude difference likely accounts for dozens of miles alone. SAM ranges always take into account the possibility the target will change course, which will mean the interceptor missile has to spend energy to change course as well, which lowers range. So what sort of a range could SM-6 do against jet aircraft? That figure isn't really given, but there are some indications out there. For a brief time 20 years ago, there existed an SM-2 Block 4 missile, which used the same airframe, same booster and same rocket motors. It was basically a precursor to the SM-6, only with different avionics and guidance. Block 4's range was claimed to be some 150 miles. As that missile had no land attack mode, that surely pertained to range against aircraft. Of course, its possible actual range was different from the stated range. But the late model SM-2s without the booster yet using the same airframe and rocket motor are credited with a range of some 105 miles. So that Mk-72 booster, which gets the missile to Mach 2 or so and which gets it to some 7,000 feet up, is supposed to add over 40 miles of additional reach, which sort of checks out. Again, it's plausible that the addition of GPS to the SM-6 and a different trajectory added some additional range. So even against aircraft, the SM-6 might go farther, perhaps even approaching 200 miles. Now the AIM-174 is a bit different from the SM-6. It is launched at lower velocity than the booster would launch it, but at over 4 times the altitude. That altitude advantage should yield tens of percent of added range, perhaps even add 50% more range, while the velocity disadvantage might at the same time lower it by only 10 or so percent. So while there are no range figures out there, it's plausible that if against aircraft SM-6 had 150 to 200 mile reach, the AIM-174, when fired from a high-flying plane, should have a 210 to 280 mile reach, give or take. That's effectively double the range or more compared to either Phoenix or AMRAAM missile. So it's a huge change to the lethal reach of US missiles. Let's compare it with some other long-range missiles. The R-37 missile is the longest-reaching Russian missile. Its export variant is advertised with 125-mile reach. There are claims the domestic variant can extend that to 190 miles, but who knows? There was one more Russian missile that started development in the 1990s, the KS-172, and it may have even come close to AIM-174's weight and on range on paper, but it never got out of development limbo, and it is not in use. The Chinese so-called PL-17 missile is in use since the last year or so. Its range wasn't disclosed, but due to its size and likely ballistic trajectory, it could plausibly reach over 250 miles. That's only conjecture, but Royal United Services Institute, in one of its pieces on Chinese missiles, did also mention 400 kilometers as the missile's possible range. AMRAAM and Meteor missiles should top out at 125 miles, give or take, though they fly different trajectories and aren't optimized for the same kind of targets at 125 miles away. There is the US AIM-260 missile in development. Unlike the AIM-174, it's so secret that nothing is known about it, except that it will likely retain the weight and dimensions of the AMRAAM for commonality reasons. It's definitely gonna outrange the AMRAAM and will likely improve its outer reach performance, but whether that's a 150 or 190 mile missile, that's unknown at this point. A more detailed comparison is hard to do as detailed information simply isn't freely available, but there are some bits of information out there. For example, the SM-6 uses an AMRAAM-derived radar seeker. That would suggest the same seeker technology as AMRAAM-D. SM-6 was devised in the 2000s and entered service a decade ago, sort of like AMRAAM-D. But given that the 174 is wider, the radar seeker has also been enlarged, offering better performance. The fact that 174 is largely the same as the SM-6 made it possible to adapt it onto aircraft and test it in mere years. Development of advanced missiles can otherwise take a decade. SM-6-like missile was first observed on a Super Hornet in 2021. before several more images appeared in 2024. Its plausible development preceding flight tests did not start much earlier. But SM-6 rests on some old requirements. It's basically the SM-2 missile with more modern avionics. It retains the mid-body straight configuration, as those provide lift to the missile. It's not configured to go very high up in near ballistic trajectories. That's understandable, as the SM-2 was made to cover all sorts of threats, from high-flying planes to low-flying anti-ship missiles. The 174's design, since it stems from the SM-2 and SM-6, is not quite optimal for long-range engagements. That doesn't take away from its likely performance and range, but it does mean that if the missile of same dimensions and weight was developed from scratch, it might feature even greater speeds and yield an even longer range. That may be achieved with future variants though. Just as the SM-3 in its later variant got a whole new missile body, the SM-6 may get similar modifications, and then eventually the air-launched AIM-174 will get them as well. But for now, for the rest of the decade, we are unlikely to hear about such developments. If range ends up being, say, 250 miles, the new missile will be very useful to the US. Taking China as an example, right now if the US wants to take out an AWACS-like plane near China, it has two options. Both involve approaching the plane to some 70 to 120 miles away, to have some chance of blowing it away. AMRAAM reaching 120 miles away would take close to 10 minutes of flight time, as the majority of its cruise would be an ever-slowing glide after the rocket motor burnt out, after the first 8 seconds or so. If the target is somehow alert and non-cooperative, and an AWACS plane with very sensitive radio signal emitter locators might be, then such a target might move by another 50 or so miles in the meantime, hence the need to actually get closer, perhaps even as close to 70 miles, to launch the missile. That's the worst case scenario, of course, but it's possible. So option 1 would have a stealthy jet make that shot. Even at 70 miles away, such shots might still hide the attacking jet from an AWACS. But the issue is, there might be a few more such AWACS planes around, looking from various angles, as China has many in service, and there are likely to be several Chinese fighters around, most sporting some large and potent AESA radar arrays. Some of those might be stealthy J-20s. Anyway, it would be a layered environment, and knowing that AWACS planes are gonna be at least 100 miles behind the frontline fighter cover, it's very unlikely even stealthy US jets would get to regularly make that shot without a fight. If one adds various shipborne radars and ground-based radars, which use larger arrays working in frequencies that deal even better with stealthy jets, it's almost impossible for the US to make such a shot with today's AMRAAM without getting into a fight first. And that's for stealthy jets. Non-stealthy jets would literally have to fight through outer layers of Chinese defenses first, before they would even get a chance to threaten an AWACS-like plane. But a missile reaching 250 miles changes that. Sure, it's so big that neither the F-22 nor F-35 can carry it internally. Right now, actually, it seems that only the US Navy is testing the missile on its Super Hornets, which, while they have their radar cross-section optimized, are far from stealthy. But Air Force's fighters could also be candidates for future use of the missile, if all goes well. The F-15 especially, as it might comfortably carry 4 while retaining lots of fuel and a decent speed. A 250-mile range if the target is not alerted and cooperative, and 200-mile range if the target is non-cooperative, means those US planes can still launch while being 100 or 150 miles away from most Chinese fighter jets doing escort and security sweep. In a hit-and-run kind of attack, where the US planes flee using afterburners after the launch, the remaining distance to Chinese fighter jets is unlikely to result in a successful pursuit for China. Except perhaps if China is using their PL-17 missiles, also long-range, to do such pursuits. But said missiles are huge and not likely to be carried in numbers. Those missiles wouldn't be a regular threat, carried in large numbers for every escort mission. Of course, there are dozens of other large planes that might be worth attacking with AIM-174s. Strategic recon, high-altitude drones, electronic emission gathering planes, dedicated anti-submarine planes even. Chinese H-6 bombers might be targets as well, being attacked as they go or even as they return from their cruise missile or anti-ship missile attack runs. 174s might even be used to intercept low-flying cruise or anti-ship missiles from far away. In said role, its aerodynamic configuration stemming from the SM-6 would actually be a benefit, not a hindrance. Crucially, SM-6 was designed to be networked, guided by third-party targeting. AIM-174 would often be used in such a way, where other aircraft, for example a forward stealthy jet, would designate targets, so a Super Hornet positioned at the rear could shoot the missile at it. Otherwise, the great range of the missile could not be utilized to the fullest. Furthermore, 174 is still lethal against agile fighter jets. Going against Chinese jets, the 174 might be launched first from afar to thin out and break apart Chinese air formations, and to make the job of stealthy jets going into a medium-range fight a bit more easier. Though such a wide scope of targets might not be easy to cover, as the missile shares the production volume with the SM-6 missile, whose production volume and inventory is not very high as it is. The SM-6 is really a multi-role missile. That makes it versatile, but it also means it's spread out thin for various users and uses. In recent years, even the US Army got some, as they use it from truck launchers to pursue land and ship targets. When used from Aegis ships, it also has limited anti-ballistic missile capabilities, even against medium-sized, slower ballistic missiles. Even more importantly, according to Navy officials themselves, it's the best missile the Navy has for intercepting hypersonic gliders. To be fair, the same officials said that capability is marginal, which means all other missiles are even worse. So similar other missions could be very well within AIM-174's capabilities. Just like its ship-launched sibling, the 174 might be able to hit static land targets. Its warhead is decentish, so against certain unarmored targets it could still do damage. But perhaps more crucially against China, the 174 might also be an anti-ship missile. Like the SM-6, its radar seeker might see high-contrast targets, such as ships at sea, and could lock and engage moving ships. Again, a small warhead might not kill a ship, but it may very well neutralize important parts of it, like sensors and antennas. Also, if such ground targets are engaged, then the reach would be even longer. If a ship-launched SM-6 can reach 250 miles against such a target, then a plane-launched AIM-174 should be able to reach well over 300 miles and hit a land or naval target. The AIM-174 just reached operational service. A US Navy spokesperson claimed so in early July. The labels on the missiles observed so far are varied. There is the AIM label. That means the missile is an instrumented test version, holding measurement equipment inside it. Basically, the missile may not quite have finished its entire testing process, but the urgency is clearly such that it's good enough to be put into service. There were images of the ATM label on some missiles inside a hangar of an aircraft carrier. That label shows it's a ground handling training version, for the ground crews to get acquainted with the missile. The fact we're getting images of the missiles taken by regular aircraft carrier crew suggests the missile is slowly proliferating into service. Thus, a true Phoenix missile successor has arrived, 50 years later. Anyway, before we go about those altitude versus velocity figures, there's an AMRAAM simulation document out there based on quite precise AMRAAM measurements and based on known engine weight, burn time, likely rocket motor fuel composition, and so on. That document gives out pretty detailed flight trajectories, and it shows the following. At Mach 1.8 launch, AMRAAM C5 will reach 38 kilometers when doing a low-level launch from just 500 meters in altitude. At the same speed, a 5-kilometer altitude launch, which is higher than the SM-6 booster separation, the missile will go 28% farther. At 10 kilometers up, it will go 85% farther. Mind you, the AIM-174 launch would likely happen at an even greater altitude, probably at 12 kilometers or more. Same conditions were explored with the launch plane going Mach 1.5. The increases weren't noticeably bigger, 15% more for the 5-kilometer altitude launch and 18% more for the 10-kilometer altitude, over their Mach 1.8 figures. All that shows launch altitude matters much more than launch speed when it comes to missile range. And remember, Binkov may talk about war, but only real peace can bring us all together.